tell my bitch I make a living on the race course.
EA Sports.
It's only a game.
Hey, I've been to Yale.
Scanning, control, manipulate scientific data, take over, blast, control, world government, shut down infrastructure, ship everything to China. Just look at this person.
Raindrops, drop top, smoking up, cooking a hot pot, fucking on your bitch, yeah, cooking up dope in the crock pot.
Mr. Kojima, are you here? Kojima, are you here?
This is B1. Arriving shortly at LZ.
Do you like it?
Mr. Hideo Kojima.
2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later.
NANI?何?お前はもう死んでいる。
Tell me another way people say mother.
What about mommy?
Okay. Okay. Oh, mommy.
Right.
Not mommy. Y'all think, really, that y'all can take all these words that's the same and just say them different because you want to? Nanny? Nana? Nani?
何?お前はもう死んでいる。
Stop clapping.